God, I love that new opening. Welcome, my friends. Thank you for being with me for another week of the Dave Champion Show. I've got some interesting things to talk to you about. Now, I'm going to start with an apology. Last week, I spent the entire show talking about the income tax. And this week, I'm going to spend some time too, but unexpectedly. The reason is there was a tremendous, a stupendous win against the IRS, which specifically begins to undercut the fraud, the scam that I told you about last week. So let's talk about that a little bit. The case is Muncie v. Internal Revenue Service. It's out of the U.S. 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. It deals with something called a notice of deficiency, known as a NOD. And what a notice of deficiency is when the government claims that you owe taxes, they have to notify you of that. So the way they establish this notice, the act of giving notice, is they generate a document called a notice of deficiency. And as per the statute, they send it out to the target taxpayer. Okay? But the question is, are these NODs, notice of deficiencies, are they created lawfully? The answer is no. People, researchers such as myself in the tax honesty movement, have known this forever. Okay? However, the tax court has rejected this reality time and time again. The 8th Circuit just told them, what are you doing? No, they're right. You, the IRS, you're wrong. Tax court, you're wrong. Finally, we're talking like 25 years into this thing. Finally, a United States Circuit Court of Appeals told the IRS and tax court, you're wrong. Not a little bit wrong, 100% wrong. So this is huge. Now, what happened was Muncie went to the tax court and he took this interesting tact. He went to the tax court seeking to have the tax court declare that it had no jurisdiction. Okay? Interesting twist, yes? His basis for that was if the NOD was not correctly, lawfully, in accordance with the statutes issued, then it's an invalid NOD. If it's not valid, you, the tax court, have no jurisdiction in this case because a non-valid NOD is no NOD at all. Okay? That was the argument. So let's talk a little bit about what Muncie's argument was, because this is something I know very well, you all not so much. Congress vests 100% of the authority for enforcing U.S. tax laws in the Secretary of the Treasury. I shouldn't say 100%. There is one single, relatively meaningless exception. So we'll say 99.99999% of tax laws, Congress vests the Secretary of the Treasury with the authority to enforce it. So how does everybody else get to enforce it? Well, very simple. There's something called delegation of authority orders. And these are quite strict and quite literal. Okay? The Secretary of the Treasury must fill out a declaration, a delegation of authority order delegating the authority Congress has given him down to the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service if it's a tax governed by the Internal Revenue Service. Okay? Then the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service has to delegate it downward again to whoever he wants to have enforce it. Now, that may be, say, a upper management level, but the upper management people, they're not actually doing the work. So they then again, delegation of authority orders down to the troops, the frontline people who are doing the work. So there has to be a delegation of authority order, a line of delegation of authority, all the way from the Secretary of the Treasury, Commissioner of the Internal Revenue, and downward to whoever is finally at the bottom of this process. You're the guy or you're the gal, by title, of course, by job description. Okay, pretty simple stuff. So, and it's very important to understand that these are written delegation of authority orders. It's not like, yeah, I told Joe to do it. No. These are written delegation of authority orders. So they're very easy to track down. So in this case, Muncie's notice of deficiency had been signed by a job title. The woman's name was irrelevant. The job title, Technical Services Territory Manager. Okay? Technical Services Territory Manager. Guess what? There is no delegation of authority order in existence anywhere within the construct of the Treasury to the Commissioner and downward that allows what was your name? The Technical Services Territory Manager. I'm just going to call it Territory Manager from now on. There is no such delegation of authority for a territory manager to sign a notice of deficiency. Zero. So the tax court called this a frivolous argument. Let me explain what frivolous is. Frivolous is not when you make an argument that the court doesn't like. That's not frivolous. What the courts determine or they claim is frivolous is if that argument has been made and rejected time and time again. Okay? There comes a point where it's been made and rejected so many times, the court says you're making a frivolous argument. Now, the really significant thing about this is the argument doesn't have to be frivolous, okay? As you and I would use the term. The argument could be spot on legally, but if in a corrupt system, such as the tax court, that valid argument that comports itself with the statutes and the regs, they just go, la, 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 we don't want to hear that. Frivolous argument, get it out of my courtroom, frivolous argument. Okay, if they do that enough times, then when you bring the argument in, they say it's a frivolous argument, even though it's 100% factual. So that is exactly what happened to Muncie. The court threatened him with sanctions, okay, and ruled against him, of course. So then it was appealed, and it was appealed to the district court and then on to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. Now, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals did something incredibly novel, for which I give them big applause, okay? Pat on the back. They actually read the law. Right? They read the law. Who's supposed to sign the nod? Well, there's this thing called delegation of authority, and it has to be followed, right? And they went down the delegation of authority. Territorial manager is not on the list, not one of the people delegated, okay? So here's what happened. The Eighth Circuit, now when a court vacates something, they can vacate a portion of a ruling. They don't need to vacate the whole thing, okay? So it's important to note that in this case, the Eighth vacated the entire decision of tax court, okay? They left not one word, not one piece of punctuation left standing. They remanded the case back down to tax court with instructions to determine whether the nod was in fact valid, having been executed by a person who is authorized by delegation of authority order. Okay? Now, these delegation of authority orders, they're not just at the whim of the agency director. They also have to comport themselves with the statutes and the regs. We've talked about what the regs are on this show before. Congress passes a statute. That's what the Supreme Court has called the broad language of the statute, right? Then the agency, presumed to have far more expertise at that subject matter than congressmen and senators, then writes the regulations, which puts the meat and the flesh on the bone. And I always say that the statute is skeletal, and then the regulations come in and put the meat and the flesh on the bone. Okay, so these delegation of authority orders, they have to match the statute and they have to match the regulations. You can't just wave your magic wand and make anybody within that chain of delegation of authority. So it gets remanded back down to the tax court. So what was the government's argument when it went back to tax court? Government said a territorial manager can sign a notice of deficiency under the authority of the Internal Revenue Manual. No. The Internal Revenue Manual is not law. Okay? The IRS likes to say that the Internal Revenue Manual is a reflection of the law. In other words, it is supposed to tell the employees of the Internal Revenue Service how to do their job in compliance with the law. But I can point out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases where the Internal Revenue Manual instructs individuals to do things which are absolutely illegal, totally adverse to the law. Because, of course, the entire thing is a scam. Okay? I've said it's the largest financial crime in the history of the world. It's being perpetrated by the Treasury Department and then down to the IRS and the employees of the IRS. And you, the American people, are the victim of this fraud, this scam. And so what the Eighth Circuit did is they just undercut a huge aspect of the scam. Because guess what the IRS has to do in order to collect from anyone it claims owes a tax? It has to issue the notice of deficiency. Okay? If they can't do it legally, huge problem. It's like putting the foot on the brake, right? If you can't do it legally, you can't do it at all. And that's what the Eighth Circuit said. This is gigantic. Now, since the tax court received arguments from both when the Eighth Circuit sent it back down to tax court and told them to evaluate within the law. Why would you have to tell a court to do that? Evaluate within the law whether or not the notice of deficiency was signed lawfully and legally. Both sides submitted arguments to the court. I just told you what the government's argument. Muncie's, of course, is very clear. There's no delegation of authority. Okay. So what has the tax court done since then? Nothing. Zip, zilch, nada. They've heard the arguments. And remember, they said the matter was simple. The tax court said, frivolous arguments gone out of court. This is a very simple, straightforward matter. Well, when the Eighth Circuit remanded it back down to them and gave them the standard on what they had to judge, suddenly they can't come up with a decision. Because they don't want to rule against the IRS, because they are part of the IRS no matter what they say. And this is incredibly damaging. When I get back, I'm going to talk about something very, very similar. And I'll be back in just a moment. We are back. Been talking about the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals really throwing it would be hard to overestimate the size of the monkey wrench that the Eighth Circuit just threw in the IRS's process, okay? By stating that the IRS has to follow the rules when it comes to issuing notice of deficiency. Now, I said the Internal Revenue Manual is not law. It's supposed to be a reflection of law. But there's been a huge problem since 1998, because in 1998, Congress passed the 1998 IRS Reform and Restructuring Act. Okay? Now, the IRS Reform and Restructuring Act of 1998 was nothing but a desperate attempt to hide the truth from the American people. Because during the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, as the IRS was creating its Internal Revenue Manual, its training documents, its various other computer record systems and so forth, they did not think ahead to the days of the internet. They did not think very much at the time about Freedom of Information Act. Okay? That was not it wasn't even enacted until the 70s, and then its significance grew slowly. They also did not anticipate a day and time when Congress would tell agencies that every single thing that a person could arguably receive under the Freedom of Information Act, having made a request under that act, must be available online. Okay? The agencies didn't, the IRS in particular, that's what we'll limit this to, the Treasury Department, did not think ahead to those days. So all of the documentation that showed crystal clear that this was a massive scam, that told the truth about who the tax applied to and who it did not apply to, who various parts of the agency, who they could go after and who they were not authorized to go after, that you read this and you're like, oh, I get it, doesn't apply to 97% of the American people. Okay? It was very, very clear. And Congress had told them, I think they had to do it by 99 or 2000, they had to have all these things on their website available for the American public to look at. You can imagine the panic in the Internal Revenue Service. So what they did is they passed the 1998 Reform, Congress passed the 1998 Reform and Restructuring Act. Congress probably believed it was something legitimate, but it was not. It was written all by the Treasury Department in a desperate move to hide everything. Because what they did with the IRS Reform and Restructuring Act is they took all of the old, it obsoleted all of the old documents, the old Internal Revenue Manual, the old training manuals, internal documents of virtually every kind. They all were obsoleted. That was part of the thing. Oh, well, now that we're doing this restructuring, all those documents are obsoleted. Guess what? Under the Freedom of Information Act, documents that have been obsoleted are not available. Okay? All that evidence ceased to become available. And then they hurriedly rushed together a horrible, horrible structure of the IRS. They scattered every place where there was something linear you could track to this guy, to this guy, to this guy, to this guy, and it was really simple to hang them with their own nonsense. Okay? They scattered all those parties to the wind. Now, instead of having a linear command structure that you could march down and follow. Now this guy reported to this guy on the other side of the country, but sometimes he reported to this guy. And it was meant to obfuscate. Yeah. Well, here's the problem. None of that changed any of the statutes or the regs. Okay? They made some regulatory changes, but very, very few. So the same statutes that created the structure of the IRS for 40 years before that, and the regulations that that structure had to apply to or had to be in compliance with remain the same. So statutes and regs remained essentially the same, probably 98% the same. Statutes 100% the same, regs about 98% the same. But they took all this that relies on that and they made scrambled eggs out of it. Okay? It was a desperate attempt. What they were trying to do is hide the truth. But when they didn't change the statutes and they didn't change 98% of the regs, all of this over here, the scrambled eggs, became no longer compliant. Okay? But you got to understand, it was a desperate attempt to save the fraud, to save the scam, to prevent you from knowing the truth. So, when we talk about these things, for instance, the notice of deficiency, okay? 26 U.S.C. section 6212. If the Secretary determines there is a deficiency in respect of any tax, he is authorized to send notice of such deficiency to the taxpayer. That's the whole basis of that. Okay? If the Secretary of the Treasury, remember, I said Congress vested 100% of the authority in the Secretary. Then the Secretary delegates it downward. So if the Secretary determines that there is a deficiency in respect to any tax, he is authorized to send notice of such deficiency to the taxpayer. That's the notice of deficiency. But what comes before the notice of deficiency, right? Because I'm going to march this back and show you this. The same con that the Eighth Circuit found exists everywhere, okay? What if you haven't filed a return because you happen to own my book, you've read it, and you know I'm not subject to the tax, I haven't been made liable, nothing, I don't have to play this game, okay? So, 6020B. Okay? If any person fails to make any return required by any internal revenue laws or regulations made thereunder at the time prescribed thereof, the Secretary shall make such return from his own knowledge and from such information as can be obtained through testimony or otherwise. Okay? That is what's called a substitute for return, or SFR. And that's when the IRS fills out a return because you didn't. But there are very important words in that statute that IRS employees just blow off every single time. And I'm going to describe the fraud to you in a minute. But the words that they blow off are words 8 through 18 in the statute, which are a return required by any internal revenue laws or regulations made thereunder. A return required, okay, by any internal revenue laws. That's the part they just blow off. Okay? And I'm going to explain how. When they want to claim that you owe a tax, before they can get to the notice of deficiency issue, on which Muncie just won hugely, they have to create an assessment. Okay? Assessments are supposed to be done on what's called a Form 23C Certificate of Assessment. And just like the NODs, they're to be signed by certain designated people. The 23C actually has a spot right on it for the IRS staff employee who's authorized by statute, by regs, and by delegation of authority orders, there's actually a spot right there for them to sign the bottom of the 23C. Why is that important? That's important because the IRS must verify that you are a person required to sign a return. So there's somebody to hold accountable for that. Because how do we know that? Well, we take the law, we take the facts, we match the facts with the law, and we see, is this person under the law required to file a return? Okay. Somebody's got to be in charge of making that decision, right? It's not necessarily making the decision, but signing off on it is probably a better way. The person who says, okay, explain this to me. Let me look at the facts and the records. And, okay, I say, I'm going to put my stamp of approval on this, that this is constitutional. Okay? That's the signature line that is at the bottom of the 23C. However, guess what? A couple decades ago, the IRS stopped using the Form 23C, and it went to something called a RACS Report -006. And they use that as a dodge to get around the 23C because just like the nod, the 23C, it's too easy to prove that it's false or hold somebody personally accountable and so forth. So what they do now is a manager signs off on this RACS report, which is nothing but a compilation of thousands of supposed tax assessments. It's a computer list that goes on, and thousands of names and taxpayer identification numbers and random numbers generated by the computer. And then there's like a number at the bottom, like $102,479.32. Okay? And the manager, the RACS report, which the manager who signs it knows nothing about whether any of this is valid or not. It's just spitted in by the computer. The manager signs the RACS report. And the IRS says, well, yeah, that's legal. Even though it completely obliterates the purpose of the Form 23C, which is the original form created when the IRS was running with some legality. Okay? So, the entire system is based on fraud. So how do they even begin the fraud process if you don't file a return because you know you're not the guy? Okay? Well, a revenue agent pulls a blank 1040 out, writes your name on it, writes your social security number, or if it's a business, the EIN on it, and he looks at that and he goes, look, a tax return. I'm not kidding. It's called a dummy return. That's actually the parlance for it in the Internal Revenue Manual. So then he sets the dummy return aside, and he gets on his computer, and he opens a tax module against this person with this number. That he just wrote it on a return. The person never filed a return. And by the way, he or she does not sign it at the bottom, so it doesn't meet the standard, again, of being a return. I'm going to get to that in a minute. So here's what Congress has said about returns. This is 26 U.S.C. 6061. Any return, statement, or other document required to be made under any provision of the Internal Revenue laws or regulations shall be signed in accordance with the forms and regulations prescribed by the Secretary. They don't sign the dummy returns. This whole thing is one big scam from front to back. The IRS training manual back in the 1980s for revenue agents and revenue officers used to instruct the frontline troops, the revenue officers and the revenue agents, not to create a substitute for return for an American citizen, but to always leave that to upper management because of potential constitutional issues. I have read that in the 1980s revenue officer training manual with my own eyes. Okay? But today, they run amok. Okay? They do whatever they want. Why are they getting away with doing whatever they want? Well, the answer is the government wants to steal your money. And they don't care how they do it, as long as the outcome is that they get the money. Fortunately, in Income Tax Shattering the Myths, I explained to people how to step completely outside this incredibly corrupt system. I'm going to talk more about this incredibly corrupt system when we get back from the break, right after these words. No revolution. We're back. Now, we've been talking about the scam, the fraud, as committed by the Internal Revenue Service against 100 million Americans every single year. I should add, knowingly, willfully, and intentionally by the top ranks. They know the truth. Now, let me give you an example of that. From 1997 to 2002, the IRS commissioner was a fellow named Charles Rosati. Now, Charles Rosati, the reason that Congress made him the commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service is that he was the co-founder of something called the American Management Systems. And American Management Systems specialized in creating very complex software systems. I'll give you some examples. They created key systems such as the accounting system for the entire city of New York. Everything that the city of New York does, you can imagine how incredibly complex their accounting system must be. That company created the accounting software and systems for the city of New York. They also created the standard procurement system for the United States Defense Department. That dwarfs what they did for the city of New York. So on the heels of that, and he was a co-founder, the heels of that, he was made the commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. And his mission was, this was the big thing that they were talking about when they made him the commissioner. He understands computers. He's worked with these massive computer systems. He understands software and development, and he's created these fabulous products that has really helped government be more efficient. So now he's going to do the same thing for the IRS. Nope, never happened. And see, I laugh at this stuff. I lived through all of this. This may be brand new to you, but to me, this is just like, it's just nice to be able to tell people about it because it's history that nobody knows, and it's alternately infuriating and humorous all in the same breath, at least for me, as long as I've known about it. It never happened, and here's why. If they were going to develop software for the IRS, okay, to bring it into the 21st century, this wouldn't be a job, obviously, for 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 guys. This would be a job that would involve thousands of people, but more importantly, hundreds of people, minimum hundreds of people, would be exposed to the information of what was legal and what wasn't, what was constitutional and what isn't, as they were writing the new software. Okay? So guys would be writing code, but somebody had to have many people would have to have an overview, okay? The statute says this, the regulation says that, and so we need to be in compliance, we need to write the code this way. You see the problem? First of all, if they wrote the new software in accordance with the statutes and the regs as one large project with project supervisors throughout, okay, there would have been literally hundreds of people who would have gone, wait a second, something is seriously amiss, because what I'm being asked to write does not comport itself with the laws I was shown and told what I'm working on, my bite of the apple, my part of the project, has to comply with these laws. And what they're asking me to write does not. Okay? The risk was so great that as I sit here talking to you in 2017, the IRS is functioning on the exact same computer system it was functioning on in the 70s and 80s. When Rosati took over in 1997, he tweaked some things, but that macro project to bring the IRS computing process into the 21st century never happened. Congress was ready to write the check. It couldn't happen because hundreds of people involved in the process would understand that it was a scam, and software writers are not typically politically inclined one way or the other. They're usually not like, ooh, rah, the IRS. Code writers tend to be pretty libertarian. So you can imagine the risk, how many of them might have gone public, how many of them might have gotten together and gone public as a group, okay? The risk was too high. They're still running on the same computer systems they ran on in the 70s and 80s. Now, if you are intrigued by all of this and you want to know way more about it, if it irks you, if you sit here and say, if Dave is telling the truth, this has got to be one of the worst things I've ever heard in my life. If Dave is telling me the truth, it is the largest financial crime in the history of the world, and I'm the one taking it, okay? Fortunately, I'm running a special on the book right now because we're sneaking up on the real April Fool's Day, which is April 15th, when millions of Americans sign forms that have nothing to do with them, pay money over to the government that has nothing to do with them. It's a travesty. So I'm running a special on the book right now. Let me tell you how to get this special. Go to DaveChampionsLiberty.com. There you go, DaveChampionsLiberty.com. When you get to that page, you'll see at the top, where the tabs are at the top, it says book right there next to the home link, okay? Click on book, and then when you hit that page, scroll down until you see that image. That image is actually a link. If you click on that, it takes you right into where you get the special price on the book, and you can go ahead and order it. Let me explain a little something, my opinion about what to do with the book. I think some people are trepidatious about purchasing the book. I think it comes from a couple of different angles, somewhat related. The first is the person who says, you know, I've been watching Dave Champion a long time, and I may agree with him on some things and disagree, but one thing is true, Dave Champion does not come out and talk about things unless he has his facts together. So I'm 99.9999% certain that if Dave is saying this, it's true, which means if I buy his book and learn this, I'm going to feel compelled to do something about it. And I don't want to because it's going to be disruptive to my life. I don't want to disrupt my life. Okay? These oftentimes are people who are doing pretty well. Okay? I don't want to rock my boat. A guy's got him making, $180,000, $250,000 a year. Life is good. I don't want to rock the boat. If I read this, God, I'm going to feel compelled to do something. So they're like, I'm sure it's true. I don't want to know. The second kind of person is the person who says, if I read this and it's true, I already know I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm not a boat rocker. Okay? So, but then, if I know the truth and I don't act on it, I'm not going to feel very good about myself. I'll know the truth. Every time I fill out a tax form, every time I cut a check, every time I get a letter from the IRS, every time I have to see my accountant, I'm going to be so irritated because I know the truth. Okay. Relax. All right. Here's what I want to say. This gigantic criminal theft by the United States government has been going on for so long, and it is so enshrined in our national. Everybody believes that they owe the tax because they're raised from the time they understand English. You owe the tax. Okay? So this is not something, with that sort of socialization, this is not something that's going to go away overnight. Okay? Let's be clear about that. Therefore, when I say get the book, I am not saying get the book and go out and be a warrior. Not what I'm saying. Well, I am, but not maybe in the way you think. Okay? Things happen in time in phases, correct? Many of you in your various projects, business, personal, you say, here's where I'm trying to get. So I'm going to lay some foundation, and then I'm going to lay some more foundation. Then I'm going to move it forward a little bit, a little subtly, and eventually, with the people I have to work, I'll get there. Okay? That's exactly what we're talking about. So if you're one of those people who are concerned that, oh my God, if I buy the book, I'm not going to be very happy with myself. I'm going to feel bad about the whole thing, or I'm going to feel compelled to do something, and I don't want to do it. All right. That's not necessary right now. Here's what I feel is necessary right now. Get the facts. understand the entire scam front to back. It's all in the book. By the time you get to the end, you will understand. And by the way, it's not all the way I lay it out in the book. Anybody who's read the book will tell you the way I've laid it out in the book, it's not all that complex. You will get it. Okay? Understand the facts, understand the full breadth of the scam. And by the way, one of the most startling parts about the book is when you get to the end and reflect back, you say, oh my God, I can't believe how simple the scam really is. There's all of this complexity that the government builds into it, but once you slash through the complexity and you get to the core issues, it's like, oh my God, this is so simple. The scam, the core of the scam is so simple. And step 3. Spread the word. If you get the facts, you understand the full breadth of the scam, you understand how simple it is, and you spread the word, you will have done your part. Okay? In time, when we get millions, because these things are very interesting, sometimes they percolate and they grow a little bit and they grow a little bit, and then timing strikes. And something, let's say, for the sake of argument, we'll throw it out and say 150,000 people know the truth today. Sometimes something happens as it just in the flow of time, an incident hits and a subject catches fire. Okay? I think a recent example of that would have been, say, gay marriage. You go back 10 years ago, nobody was talking about it. Nobody talked about gay marriage. Go back 3 years ago. Whoa, it was like a forest fire. It was raging through the media, and eventually we ended up with Obergefell. My point is, it went from, why would we even talk about this, to, whoa, it's everywhere. Okay? Timing, things happen. That is just as true here. Okay? But what is necessary is, as one of the founders said, to light brush fires in the minds of our fellow citizens. Okay? That is the job. So, when I say get the book, what I'm talking about is get the facts, understand the scope, spread the message. Because there is going to come a day, mark my words, there is going to come a day when this subject takes off. But it's not going to take off if everybody just sits on the sidelines and says, if it happens, it happens. I don't need to be involved in this. Yeah, you do need to be involved in this. Presuming it offends you that the federal government is lying to you, robbing you, stealing from you and 100 million other Americans. If that bothers you, get off the fence. I'll be back right after these words. Welcome back. Let's talk about a little Nye County information. I shared a couple weeks back that the results of the agreement between the county and Rick Marshall that came out of the Nevada EMRB hearing. The results of that being that Rick Marshall was completely vindicated. The county agreed to remove from Rick Marshall's file at the Nye County Sheriff's Department every single allegation made by Sheriff Sharon Worley about then Assistant Sheriff Rick Marshall's alleged misconduct. The county attorney and the county board of supervisors agreed that it was all false and to remove it, because they wouldn't have removed it if it was true, right? That would be ridiculous. Who would do that? So part of that was they would remove all of the claims of wrongdoing against Rick Marshall. Rick Marshall would then, because he doesn't want to go back to work for the sheriff's department when this corrupt sheriff is in office, that he would submit a letter of resignation. So they take out all the bad stuff, they put in his letter of resignation. That explains why he's not with the agency anymore. Voila. Okay? Simple stuff. So then, I mean, this is so clear a 6-year-old can understand. But apparently not Sheriff Worley. Because she sent Rick the following letter, which is just mind-blowing. Dear Rick, the settlement agreement made no mention. Let me go back so you understand. In Rick Marshall's retirement letter, it said that I am hereby retiring in good standing. Okay, that was the characterization in his letter. So, dear Rick, the settlement letter made no mention of good standing. You were offered and accepted the same option you were previously offered in August of 2015. You could resign or be terminated. Now, that's a lie, and I'll straighten that out in a minute, but let me continue with her letter. You resigned under a recommendation for termination issued by Under Sheriff Moody and received by you on May 4th, 2015 at 14:18 hours. The facts giving rise to that recommendation and the decision of this office being Sharon Worley, are of public record before the State of Nevada Local Government Employee Management Relations Board, EMRB. While you may believe that you were in good standing, I believe that any reasonable person viewing the record will most likely conclude otherwise. Your resignation letter is accepted without the in good standing modifier. Okay. This just defies logic. Okay. The pettiness is off the chart. Okay. Let's go back to her statement. You were offered and accepted the same option you were previously offered in August of 2015. You could resign or be terminated. No, not at all. What he was offered, if you can call it that, in 2015 was, look, Rick, we've trumped up all these BS charges against you, okay? We've never even interviewed you about the false claims we're making, because if we interviewed you on the record, your explanation would disprove all of this trumped up BS we put together against you, okay? So, with all this trumped up BS we have against you, we're gonna fire you, or you can resign, okay? Now, Rick said, I'm not resigning, I didn't do anything wrong. Kudos to Rick. So they fired him, and all of that remained in the file. Now, to be very clear, if Rick had resigned in August of 2015, none of those false claims would have been taken out of his file. They were a matter of the record of the agency, okay? There was no offer at the time, resign and we'll get rid of all these false claims against you. That was not part of the offer in 2015. I mean, clearly, since Sheriff Worley can't let this go in 2017, she sure as hell wasn't going to let it go in 2015, right? Now, that was the deal that was offered to Rick Marshall in 2015, if you can call that being offered a deal. In 2017, now an objective third party in the form of a specialized state agency which deals with these issues heard testimony all day long, okay? I think Rick testified for something like 5 hours. Yeah. Then they had a few other people who came and testified also. And when the testimony, I was going to say it's over, but it wasn't over, because the very last person who would have testified would have been Sheriff Worley. And the hearing master called the hearing right there and said, hang on, before we move forward, I want to see counsel in my office. Okay? And the statement of one of the people in the room at the time was that the hearing master said to the two attorneys, you need to make an agreement. And then he looked at Adam Levine, the attorney for the county, and he said, if we go to the end of this, which only would have been Sheriff Worley, and then they would have handed it over to the three-party panel for a decision, he said, odds are overwhelming Rick's going to get every single thing he wants. So you might want to work out an agreement now. Okay? That's pretty strong language from somebody who sits there and hears these cases day in and day out. Okay? Now, not only that, but the county attorney agreed to remove all of the false accusations against Rick Marshall from 100% of the county records, okay? When I win the election, the upcoming sheriff's election, and I'm sworn in, I better not find any of those false allegations against Rick Marshall in any of the sheriff's department files, anywhere, because the county agreement was that they would all be eradicated because they were lies, okay? Now, place yourself in the position of the county attorney. If you'd sat there all day and listened to all this testimony, and you felt, as Sharon Worley avers, that it supported Sharon Worley's determination, why would he have cut a deal? He would have simply looked at Rick's attorney and said, I've heard all this testimony, and frankly, the county is golden. We have no reason to settle with you on anything because we're going to win this. Okay? That's how it works. If the testimony shows that your position is solid, you don't come to an agreement. If the testimony shows your position is crap, then you settle. And in this case, the county gave Rick, it's a very important factor, 100% of what he asked for. And he was actually asked to come upstairs. He had gone down to get something to eat. He was actually asked to come upstairs. And the hearing master asked Rick, do you want to go back to work? Okay? That means that was on the table. Putting him back to work was on the table. And Rick said, I don't want to go back to work for the sheriff. Quite understandable. Since she rigged an entire false investigation and lied about him and then used those lies to terminate him, which brought them to that hearing. I mean, who would want to go back in that environment? So Rick said, no, as long as this corrupt sheriff, my word corrupt, he didn't use that at the time, as long as this sheriff is still in office, I don't want to go back to work. Okay. The hearing master said, great, that makes hammering out the agreement a little bit easier. Okay. That also conveys that if an agreement was not reached, and they had gone on and heard testimony from Sharon Worley, which clearly would have been like, that would have been like the final fucking iceberg that sank the Titanic, okay? But had she testified and then they'd called the hearing and given it over to the the three-party panel that makes the determination, based on that conversation, we can't predict the future, but with great certainty, it would appear not only would they have given Rick Marshall every single thing he asked for, but they would have ordered him back to work. But they wouldn't have ordered him back to work. They would have ordered the sheriff's department to take him back in his position as assistant sheriff. So before they got to that moment, they said, wait, let's negotiate. And there was no negotiation. Rick said, I don't want to go back to work for her. And then the county said, we're going to give Rick every single thing he asked for. Now, Sharon Worley, the sheriff, is a unique human being. And one of the points in the agreement is that she will not in any way interfere with Rick Marshall obtaining a 218 card. The 218 card is a card that is issued to someone who retires in good standing and allows that person to carry a firearm concealed in all 50 states and the possessions and territories without having a CCW. Okay? That's what a 218 card does. Now, the county agreed. Sharon didn't have any say in this. This was between the county and Rick. The county agreed that the sheriff would not interfere in Rick Marshall getting a 218 card. Now, by this letter where she says, your resignation letter is accepted without the in good standing modifier, she just violated the agreement. Because absent the modifier, he's not entitled to a 218 card, and the county already said the sheriff would not in any way attempt to stop him from getting a 218 card. By claiming she's accepting it absent that characterization, she's interfering with him getting a 218 card. She already violated the agreement that fast. And she's a liar. So, it's funny. Years ago, when I first got into the tax honesty movement and started learning the truth, I told some friends, you know what, I'm just going to keep working at this and stay low, under the profile, low profile, under the radar. And eventually I couldn't do that anymore, and I started an organization called nontaxpayer.org. It doesn't exist anymore. And a friend of mine said, what happened to low profile? I said, eventually there came a time, I'm sorry, Pat, I just couldn't do it. And that's pretty much where I come from on running for sheriff. It's not that I relish getting into an ugly campaign, a very expensive, ugly campaign. It's not that I want a government paycheck. It's none of these things. I look at stuff like this. I look at all of the many things I've talked about on this show and Totally Unprepared with Bill Carnes about the corruption, starting with the fish stinks at the head, the corruption in the Nye County Sheriff's Department. And witnessing that is why I will run and I will be the next sheriff of Nye County. Thanks for being with me. I'll talk to you again later. Bye-bye.